Welcome to the 23 January edition of Continental Commandery's Maritime History Virtual Lecture Program. I'm Fred Passman, and I'm your host for this evening. Since we recorded our first presentation in May of 2020, we've recorded presentations covering numerous Coast Guard, Marine Corps, Merchant Marine, and Navy topics. You can find our past presentations by visiting our past presentations page. And you also have the choice of visiting our YouTube channel, where you will find our complete archive of past presentations. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I want to say a few words about the Naval Order of the United States. As many of you know, the Naval Order is our nation's oldest ancestral organization dedicated to maritime history. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and celebrate U.S. maritime history and camaraderie amongst our companions who are mostly veterans of our maritime services. Anyone who served one of those services or was a direct descendant is eligible to join the Naval Order. For more information, I invite you to visit the Naval Order website, as you can see streaming below. Today's presentation is being recorded on YouTube. You'll be able to watch it as many times as you like within a few minutes after we end at the top of the hour. The same link that you used to join us this evening is the link you'll use to access the YouTube recording. During the program, you'll be able to post your comments and your questions to the comments box available on the live stream screen. And after Captain Rodgaard has completed his presentation, we will have a question and answer period. At that time, I'll share your questions with him. Captain John Rodgaard, USN retired, has over 41 years of naval service with the United States, including 19 years of commissioned service as a naval intelligence officer. He authored or co-authored several maritime history books, including A Call to Sea, Captain Charles Stewart of the USS Constitution, A Hard-Fought Ship, The History of HMS Venomous, and From Across the Sea, North Americans in Nelson's Navy. Additionally, he has contributed articles to various maritime history magazines. In 1999, Captain Rodgaard received the Naval Institute's History Author of the Year Award. You can find his full biography on the Continental Commandery's website today. In upcoming events, within the next couple of days, it will migrate over to past events. This evening, Captain Rodgaard's presentation will be about his most recent book, Tailships, The Hunt for Soviet Submarines in the Mediterranean from 1970 to 1973. Welcome aboard, John.
Well, thank you, Fred, and hello, all fellow companions of the Naval Order. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you all tonight. This is not exactly home. I happen to be in a hotel room in Santee, South Carolina, on our way up to Virginia from our home in Florida. So the weather was horrendous, at least from the standpoint of what was ice covered on Interstate 95. What normally takes us a little less than 5.5 hours, took over 8.5 hours just to get here.
And so, you're a day late, but
yeah, and a day late.
We're glad you're here to tell the tale, and that you're able to join us this evening, adapting, improvising, and overcoming.
That's
now,
right.
You were a radarman during the period covered in your book. How long have you been contemplating writing this particular book?
Well, actually, probably since the 1980s. When I was stationed over at ONI as a young intel officer, and of course watching the big board and the Soviet submarine force, I thought maybe it might be something I would like to do at some point. So it's been back in the 80s. It's been kind of bouncing around the back of the head here from the standpoint of putting something together. And it actually came to fruition thanks to the publisher Helion. They're out of England, out of the UK, and they thought it would be a good topic to cover. So it kind of came together just before COVID hit, and then obviously with COVID, I was able to write it and get it through the loops. So
excellent. We'll look forward to hearing. And at this point, I am going to move off stage and give you the deck and the con. So it's all yours, John.
Thank you, Fred. And again, good evening, everyone. Tailships. Well, it's a story of 3 U.S. destroyer escorts. Their crews comprising Escort Squadron 8 during the height of the Cold War, specifically the Cold War below, on, and above the Mediterranean. And now the objective of this book was simply to tell the story of these 3 ships, their men within the context of the greater events of the Cold War at sea, specifically in the Med, the evolution of the technology of passive sonar, stretching from the Great War of 1914-1918 through the 21st century, the successes and failures of operating in the Mediterranean with this new technology. So, obsolete, except for the state of the ASW sensor that each ship carried, the Hammerberg, Lester, and Courtney were ordered to the Mediterranean to demonstrate the potential of the sensor, a technology relying on the passive towed array sonar system sensor that the Navy officially designated as the Interim Towed Array Surveillance System, or ITASS. Now, for the crews of these ships, they simply called it the array, noodles, snakes, or tails. The system proved successful in detecting and classifying and identifying Soviet submarines that the Navy had committed resources to refining the capability of passive towed array sensors. Because of this success, development of the towed array surveillance system, TASS, the surveillance towed array sonar system, SURTASS, and the tactical towed array sonar, TACTASS, were future systems in which we still have modifications of these systems in the fleet. Additionally, the squadron, here's the interior of what the van looked like, pretty simplistic. Additionally, the squadron's ships and men operated in the sea surrounded by increasing tensions of the Middle East. Now, little did the men of Escort Squadron 8 know at the time that they were not only operating during the peak of the Cold War, but witnessing the social and political convulsions that continue to this very day. Now, for many of the junior sailors aboard these ships, it was their first time overseas. However, the more senior enlisted, as well as officer personnel, had made at least one 6-month deployment in the Mediterranean. We had even fewer Vietnam veterans, but for all, it was the first time to call a foreign port home. Additionally, many of the married officers and mid-level and senior petty officers took advantage of the Navy's policy and brought their families to set up housekeeping in Naples, Italy. Also, many bachelor sailors, both officers and enlisted, would rent apartments in the city in or out of the Neapolitan suburbs. Many, included myself, would spend the entire 3-year period either sailing in the Mediterranean or living alongside their Neapolitan neighbors. Now, my approach was first, as I said, to place the Tailships within the greater context of the Cold War, specifically the Cold War at sea and in the Mediterranean. When the United States decided to build up its political, economic, and military strength to counter Soviet expansionism, the U.S. Navy developed a maritime strategy to support the Joint Chiefs of Staff's planning for confronting the Soviet Union. It was a blue water strategy, excuse me, that would contribute to the overall containment strategy by conducting offensive operations with aircraft carriers and battle groups capable of launching aircraft that could carry nuclear bombs to strike the Soviet homeland. During the first 2 decades of the Cold War, U.S. Navy and Royal Navy carrier battle groups frequently operated in the Norwegian Sea, the Mediterranean, and/or the North Pacific without too much concern that Soviet air or naval assets would track them. To counter US and British carrier battle groups, the Soviet Navy, under the leadership of Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, adopted an asymmetrical approach. Excuse me. What the Soviets described as a scientific, technical, and revolution in military affairs. The medium Whiskey class Project 613 class diesel submarines, incorporating features of the German Type 21 U-boat, were mass-produced, and when the last unit was completed in 1957, a total of 236 units had been built. Several of the Whiskies were modified, were retrofitted to carry the SSN-3 Shattuck anti-ship cruise missile, which had a range of up to 400 nautical miles. In addition, the Soviet Navy modified several of its destroyers and small fast attack craft and purpose-built cruisers fitted with anti-ship cruise missiles, such as here's this Kinder-class cruiser with SSN-3 Shattuck missiles. Additionally, this asymmetrical approach included air. The Soviets developed an anti-surface air-to-surface missile and carried by their first generation of jet bombers, the Tu-16 Badger. In total, it was a combined arms approach with nuclear weapons. As Admiral Gorshkov summed it up, the course taken required the construction of an ocean-going fleet capable of carrying out offensive strategic missions. Submarines and shore-based naval aircraft equipped with nuclear weapons, missiles, or torpedoes had the leading place in the program. Thus, there began a new stage in the development of the fleet and of its naval science. End of quote from Admiral Gorshkov. Now, for this to work, they needed to develop a robust multi-source intelligence capability. And they did this over the period of time with humans, spies, human collection, open source, we call it, open source intelligence, newspapers, watching our television, imagery intelligence, either handheld or airborne, or it then began space-based, as well as signals intelligence, ELINT intelligence. And they combined that into a very significant capability to track us. Now, at the beginning of the Cold War, and even through the subsequent 30 years of the struggle, we, US and NATO, interpreted the Soviet Navy's revolutionary concept to mean that in wartime, Soviet submarines and supporting surface and air assets would interdict not only carrier and amphibious task groups, but the critical transatlantic sea lanes of communication, or SLOCs. With that perception, the US and NATO navies embarked on the development of a robust ASW capability designed to conduct operations against the huge number of Soviet submarines that could be deployed to interdict the SLOCs. However, this understanding was a misperception. As Norman Palmer and Edward Whitman wrote, quote, ironically, for some 35 years of the Cold War, the US and other navies were preparing, training, and exercising to fight a third battle of the Atlantic. It was, however, a battle that was neither planned nor prepared for by the Soviet leadership. It was a defensive strategy. The Soviets did not intend to interdict transiting carrier strike groups, but to attack them when they came within the Soviet defensive zones. These zones comprised the Norwegian Sea, the North Sea, the Baltic, Sea of Japan, the Northwest Pacific, and the eastern basin of the Mediterranean. Now, for the US and British, with their NATO partners such as Canada and the Netherlands, began to invest in ASW technology. The US and British initiatives initiated major submarine and destroyer frigate building modification programs, which emphasized improved active and passive sonar systems and ASW weapons possessing increased range. It recognized that as a platform, the submarine might prove to be the best for detecting, tracking, and sinking other submarines. And a two-track program for ASW submarines was initiated. The first took US Navy's newest Second World War designed fleet submarines and converted them under the Greater Underwater Propulsion Power, or GUPPY program. The GUPPY conversion streamlined the hull to improve their speed. They were equipped with snorkels and increased battery storage capability. The second track was to design a purpose-built anti-submarine, or SSK. Additionally, the U.S. Navy produced 3 advanced hull submarines of the Barbell, as you can see here, the Barbell class. Based on the prototype submarine of the Albacore, the Barbells had a teardrop-shaped hull. This hull form would become the standard hull shape for succeeding generations of nuclear-powered submarines. With the introduction of nuclear-powered attack submarines, the U.S. Navy dropped the SSK concept in favor of the SSN for hunting and killing submarines. The U.S. Navy embarked on improving their respective ASW capabilities, modernizing their World War II destroyers and destroyer escorts, as well as building modern versions of classes with improved sonars and weapons. With the GUPPY program was to submarines, the U.S. Navy's Fleet Rehabilitation and Modernization Program, or FRAM, was for the Second World War class destroyers, as you can see here. Additionally, the U.S. Navy went and adopted the concept of the hunter-killer groups, centered around a Essex-class carrier that was converted, as you can see here, as an ASW platform for fixed-wing aircraft as well as helicopters. And that she would be the centerpiece of with a destroyer or destroyer escort squadron supporting the ASW carrier. Here's the first generation. Here's the good old S2s. And so we've designed long-range carrier-based as well as land-based aircraft. The first was the P2 Neptune, followed by, of course, our great P3 aircraft. Now, the Navy developed what really became a technological ASW game changer. It was called SOSUS, Sound Surveillance Systems. The detection technology brought forward to counter a potential third battle of the Atlantic found its roots in the first Battle of the Atlantic, the Great War of 1914-1918. One was active sonar that the British and French were very much involved with, while the second was a passive technology to detect underwater sounds generated by submarines. In 1917, at the U.S. Navy's Experimental Station in New London, Connecticut, Dr. Harvey Hayes constructed a hull-mounted and towed array passive sonar system. The system was placed aboard the Pauling-class destroyer USS Jouett DD-41. On the destroyer's hull, situated on its port and starboard side, forward near the bow and below the waterline, was an array of 12 hydrophones. They were set one foot apart and encased in rubber. The length of the hull-mounted arrays was approximately 40 feet. In addition to the hull-mounted arrays, 2 towed arrays, each with another set of 12 hydrophones, was developed and were set 1 foot apart and encased in a neutrally buoyant gum rubber hose. Both 40-foot arrays were set at 100 feet below the surface and extended 300 to 500 feet behind the Jouett. Hayes' system successfully detected a submerged U.S. Navy submarine at 2,000 yards away. This was phenomenal when you think about what the technology was during the Great War period. However, with the end of the war, the Navy discontinued its R&D development of passive towed array. In 1946, though, with the end of the war, and with obviously our understanding that the Soviets were building this massive submarine fleet, the Navy, through the advisory committee that it established during the war, it was called the Committee on Undersea Warfare, sought suggestions of how the Navy should develop a capability to counter the Soviet submarine fleet. Through the committee, an MIT-sponsored effort gathered top scientists and naval officers to determine what technologies could be applied to detect, classify, and identify submerged submarines. It was collectively called Project Hartwell. Their proposals led to the Navy's Office of Naval Research in 1950 to award a contract to American Telephone and Telegraph, AT&T, and develop a sea-based surveillance system based on long-range sound propagation. The Navy named the project Jezebel. From Jezebel came Project Caesar, the code word for building and installation of the sound surveillance system SOSUS. The Navy installed the first SOSUS array off the Bahamas in early 1952. And after a series of successful detections against U.S. Navy diesel submarines, it decided to build and install identical arrays along the entire East Coast, ranging from Nova Scotia, Nantucket, Cape May, Cape Hatteras, Antigua, Barbados, starting to sound like a song, Bermuda, as well as down into Puerto Rico, and eventually Iceland and the UK. Now, it was recognized that SOSUS could not cover the world's oceans. There was a need to develop a ship-based and also a submarine-based capability. Also, the U.S. submarines were confronting the problem of what we call aft acoustic blindness due to hull baffling. And because all of the sensors for detecting submarines were located in the bow, as also when you think about our own surface ships. To resolve these two-tiered interrelated challenges, O&R contracted the Chesapeake Instrument Corporation to build and test several passive towed array sonars. One array was towed from the sale of the USS Albacore, and Chesapeake Instrument Corporation conducted the sea trial of a large diameter arrays in the Bahamas in December of 1961. This proved successful, and production soon followed. So the first generation of passive towed array sonars were on our submarines. In 1964, the oceanographic research vessel, the Sir Horace Lamb, belonging to Columbia University and stationed at the university's field station at St. David's, Bermuda, was selected to take on board a CIC-designed towed array. The Chesapeake Instrument Corporation engineers designed a horizontal array with two AN-AQ-2 Jezebel airborne low-frequency analysis system, or LOFAR, sonar buoys, and fixed them 350 feet apart. They borrowed the two Jezebels from the U.S. Naval Air Station in Bermuda, from an ASW squadron that was based there, and with the array sending acoustic data to the ship's correlation detection gear, known by the acronym CODAR, the sensor successfully detected U.S. Navy snorkeling submarines at 67 to 70 nautical miles in May of 1965. And in 1967, the Deputy Director for Research, Development, Engineering commissioned Bell Labs to study whether the hydrophones of the Mediterranean, or I should say hydrodynamics of the Mediterranean, would serve as a medium for passive towed array sonar to detect submerged submarines. Bell Labs conducted tests in the Med for several months in 1967, and the study, quote, resulted in a recommendation that towed arrays be deployed in the Mediterranean for submarine surveillance, end of quote. But there was a caveat. The Ionian Sea had extremely high and low ambient frequency noise levels, which were caused by marine life and ship traffic. They calculated that such an intense level of ambient noise would allow a passive towed array to detect a submerged submarine only inside a range of 3,000 yards, not much more beyond what happened in 1917. Now, just before Christmas, DoD Deputy Director Dr. Sebastian brought together manufacturers. He presented a one-hour briefing on the problem of detecting subs in the Med to BTL, Hughes, Litton, and CIC. Then the U.S. Naval Underwater Sound Laboratory wrote specifications for a Mediterranean surveillance system. The specs were given to NAVSEA Command, and then they were released to manufacturers who attended the meeting in December for bids. I'm giving you this timeline because it just shows you how quickly this turned around. It was remarkable. On 29 May 1968, the Undersea Lab received the bids and recommended to NAVSEA that the Chesapeake Instrument Corporation be awarded the contract to produce 3 towed array systems. But CIC was the lowest bidder. NAVC rejected the recommendation, said only a large company such as Hughes should be contracted. In stepped Vice Admiral Charles Martel. He was executive director of the ASW programs, Op 95, and he did not reject going ahead to build the system, but he rejected that the large companies such as Hughes should build 3 of them. Hughes was wanting over $11 million for 3 systems, while CIC was saying we could do it $1 million apiece. Anyway, it was really fascinating. He said at the end of the meeting, give it to the lowest bidder. It's not going to work anyway. So much for confidence. With production beginning in late 1968, the Navy decided that 3 DEs would operate ITASS. And these DEs were 3 of the Dealey Courtney class destroyer escorts that were out of Newport, Rhode Island. 1970 would witness major change to the operational status of 4 DEs. There was a 4th one. All would trade their cadre status to return to operational status with the Atlantic Fleet. Their role as destroyer escorts possessing a robust anti-submarine warfare capability. Here's the original configuration of the Dealey and Courtney class destroyer escorts. I'm sure many of you remember seeing them. They would be stripped of their ASW warfare armory for the most part. They would be altered, stripped of their weaponry, as I said, and upgraded with communications, and they would have this ITASS system placed on their fantail. They would become tailships, basically ASW collection systems. Now, as I mentioned, this class was also what we call FRAMmed. This is the configuration of most of all of the Dealey class, Courtney Dealey class destroyer escorts. As you can see, they have got a helicopter hangar as well as a helicopter platform. That was for the Dash, which were our first generation of airborne, well, we'll call them robots, really, right? Drones. You can see there's a box at the end at the fantail, and that's the ITASS van. So the Lester and the Hammerberg, this is their configuration. As for the Courtney, which was the flagship for the squadron, Escort Squadron 8, she was configured as a command ship. You can see the difference. There was an extent of housing on the 01 level going all the way aft towards her quarterdeck. There was offices for the Commodore and his staff for rooms and other storage capability for the squadron. Here you can see, here's the broad port quarter aspect of the Courtney. You can see the ITASS cable reel, the ITASS control van, the ITASS cable tray. There's where the technicians would go ahead and assemble the modules to the cable. And there's the ITASS guideline. Now, in my chapter, The Bear and the Eagle, I set the stage in which the tailships would find themselves. The ships would be operating in Med for the next 3 years in one of the world's most intensive maritime and naval environments. First, I described the environment, the physical geography and oceanography of the Med, and highlighted the uniqueness and challenges of the great inland sea to ASW operations. From a naval perspective, the Med was the fulcrum of the Cold War at sea. And during Escort Squadron 8's time in the Med, the Soviet Navy's 5th Escadra submarine order of battle ranged in numbers between 6 to 12 submarines. And for example, most of the submarines were conventional boats of the Foxtrot class. And based on our intelligence estimates, they were located in the choke points in the Mediterranean, the Alboran Basin, the straits between Tunisia and Sardinia, off the coast of Naples, for obvious reasons, considering Sixth Fleet was in and out of Naples all the time, in the Straits of Sicily, off of the Straits of Messina, between Crete and Libya, east of Crete, off the Levant, As well as, in addition to the Foxtrot class submarines, there would be at least one of the Juliet class. This was an SSG that carried 4 SSN of the Shattuck variant. In 1971, we were seeing the first generation of their attack submarines, the Victor I, as well as the first generation of SSGNs, the Charlie ones, which carried the SSN-7s, which had a range of 45 nautical miles, and they could be fired whilst the submarine was submerged, unlike the Juliet, which had to surface to fire its Shattocks. So this was its typical submarine force for the 5th Escadra during the period that the Tailships were in the Mediterranean. So they ranged anywhere between 5 to 12 submarines. And during Yom Kippur, there were as many as 24 submarines operating in the Med during that period of time. Now, Soviet naval philosophy, and I think it's still pretty much with Russian philosophy, it's that it's better to be ready to go to sea than it is to be at sea. What we saw very much throughout this period of time is that most of the Soviet fleet and their associated auxiliaries stayed at their what we call fair weather anchorages, such as one at the Alboran Basin, one off of Bonne, Tunisia, one in the Gulf of Hammamet, one off Cape Passaro, one off of Kithra, one east of Crete, Sollum in Egypt, off of east of Cyprus. These were fair weather anchorages in which the Soviet 5th Escadra would spend most of its time. And they would sortie out for exercises and or also to counter our carriers, specifically as our carrier battle groups moved into the Eastern Mediterranean. Think about the defensive zone, as zones that I showed earlier in this presentation. So, for example, the major surface combatants such as the Kinda, the Cresta 1, the Cresta 2, the Cashin-class DDGs, as well as their hybrid Moskva-class CHGs, cruiser helicopter carriers, were the principal surface combatants in the Mediterranean. Usually they never topped over 12 units during the period the Tailships were there. Most of the 50-some ships that would be in the Mediterranean were, for the 5th Escadra, were auxiliaries, such as AGIs, AGSs. These are the intelligence gathering ships that were positioned against our battle groups. As well as in 1970, when the Tailships arrived into the Mediterranean, there was a squadron of Tu-16 Badgers out of Egypt, as well as IL-38s, ASW version. Well, it's their version of our P-3 Orions. Now, from the standpoint of the United States Navy in the Mediterranean, I'm sure this will be flashback time for many of you. We had our submarine base Magdalena in Sardinia. Sixth Fleet flagship was out of Gaeta, and down the coast at Naples, we had was basically the watering hole for the U.S. Sixth Fleet. We had support activities. We had at least 5 or 6 commands at the time. Also, there was Rota, which was a principal base, and at that time we had a squadron of SSBNs stationed there, and I want you to keep that in mind. Also, we had air station at Sigonella, with addition at Rota, and normally we had two P3 squadrons, one at Sigonella and one at Rota. Now, at any given day, during this period that the Tailships were in the Med, there were 2 carrier battle groups. Here's, for example, the USS Franklin Delano Roosevelt and her air wing. She would have cruisers and destroyer squadron supporting her. Here's a picture of the Independence. And we also, as I mentioned earlier, had a squadron centered around a ASW carrier such as the Intrepid. Supporting that, we had a full squadron of AOEs, AORs. We also had two amphibious ready groups centered around two carriers, helicopter carriers, as well as something like over 2,500 Marines in each one of these groups. I mean, the number of ships that we had was incredible, the number of platforms that we had in the Mediterranean. And I mentioned earlier, we also had SSBNs. The reason why they were in the Med at this time, because we had just the first generation of the Poseidon missiles, which only had a range of about 2,some hundred miles. So we had submarines such as this is the Andrew Jackson operating in the Mediterranean. Additionally, we would have up to 4 SSNs of the Permit Sturgeon class. And we had the last hurrah, if you would, of our guppy boats. Normally would have about 2 of these. They would counter the Foxtrots, but also they were used as targets during our ASW exercises, especially our National Week exercises. And of course, I mentioned earlier, 2 squadrons of P3s, one at Sigonella and one at Rota, Spain. Now, for the Tailships, Naples Inner Harbor would be their home in the next 3 years. That anchor represents where they were. We were always med-moored with our sterns towards the mole. Now, by the time they arrived to set up housekeeping, there was a very large U.S. and NATO command contingent and facilities in Naples. There were 5 major military activities operating in Naples: Headquarters of Allied Forces Southern Europe, AVSouth, Commander Fleet Air Mediterranean, ComFair Med, U.S. Naval Support Activity, Naples, Naval Air Facility, and Naval Communications Station, NAVCOM Stay Naples. In fact, ComFair Med, we supported the squadron was part of Task Force 67, which was the ASW and reconnaissance task force for 6th Fleet. Now, however, maintenance and material support to the Tailships were very different from the support of other units, home-ported destroyers. And I'm mentioning this because unlike Yokosuka, Japan, that had everything you could need, this was very limited. And over the course of 3 years, the ship's capabilities degraded significantly, in which by summer of 1973, INSURF had come in and condemned all 3 ships. They needed to go back home because they were thoroughly and completely worn out. Excuse me. Here's a photograph of the submarine, the destroyer tender Cascade, and you could see our 3 tail ships. There's the Lester 1022, the Hammerberg 15, and the Courtney inboard 1021. And we have a looks like a Permit class SSN alongside. So that was basically that was the major support that these 3 ships would depend upon. Now, here's a great photograph. This was taken in 1972, and we have something like 8 ships breasted out from the Cascade, a very unusual situation. Now, from a standpoint of operational planning, first of all, it was important. We were directly subordinate to CTF 67 staff. We depended on, obviously, on the latest intelligence that came from multiple sources. We also had to consider environmental factors of where we were going, what was the sea conditions, salinity, all those kind of particulars from the standpoint of the dynamics of the subsurface of that part of the Mediterranean that we would be operating in. Rules of engagement were critical. We were not allowed to go within 30 nautical miles of the North African coast. You may remember at this time we had the Algerian Revolution, we had Tunisia, we had Libya, and they weren't exactly friendly to US NATO presence off their coasts. So we were definitely limited with regard to going that close into that area. Also, there was consideration for exercises. So we conducted Exercise National Week, in which we were used to detect our own submarines to see how well we could do against our own boats, as well as also our surface forces. And then we had special hydrographic operations, which I'll be getting more into. So there was the three distinctive planning efforts. One, obviously going after the Soviet submarine force, one exercises, and the other one was special hydrographic operations. Now, the Soviet exercises, for example, the ships would be deployed with when the 5th Escadra had a scheduled ASW operation. And we would send one or two of these ships, Tailships, there. And as you can see on the right, there's a Foxtrot class SS submarine. There is the Leningrad, the helicopter carrier, that she was flagship of the Escadra at the time. And in the background is a Cresta II. This was off of Kithra in 1971. Now, as they were doing their exercises, when their submarine would go sinker, we would then go and deploy our tails to go to try to track and localize and work against that submarine. Here is a photograph of a Foxtrot at one of the fair weather anchorages. This is at the Gulf of Hammerberg. You can see in the background there's a tanker, an Oligma class tanker, and a Petra, a light frigate alongside, probably getting fuel. So when a submarine, such as a Foxtrot, came up after, say, it's 3 months mid-deployment, we would be tasked to go and watch them. And when they got underway, we would deploy our array and try to detect and track the submarine. Here is an example of what transpired back in 1972. What you see here is those tracks are the actual tracks in which the ITASS array is deployed. So you can see in the upper left, we were hot on a submarine contact, as you saw earlier. Possibly it was one of the Foxtrots that was positioned in Tyrrhenian Sea to keep an eye on our deployers out of Naples. And also there's the northern neck of the Gulf of the Straits of Messina. And there you could see on the 17th of July, 1972, we had tracked the submarine down to the Fairweather anchorage, where the submarine came back up, and then we were ready when she went sinker. So that gives you an example of what the operational tasking against the Soviet submarine. Now, twice a year, there would be a major exchange of Russian submarines coming down from North Fleet, and they would swap out. And this usually was the conventional submarines, the Foxtrot and Juliets. Now you can see here, this is the Courtney's array in the water. This is the 28th of May, the 29th of May, the 30th of May, and you can see by these deployments that we are tracking Soviet submarines as they were entering the Mediterranean. What the Soviets would do, if you're familiar with the hydrography of this part of the Mediterranean, you have a very, very, I'll call continental shelf. It's very narrow, and it drops off very, very rapidly, below 1,000 feet, easy. Anyway, the submarines would use that continental shelf to try to mask their movements going into their allotted stations in the Mediterranean. As you can see here, we were deployed and tracking them as they were moving west to east. Here, it was in November of 1972, we had another such operation in which we had 5 Soviet Foxtrot submarines coming into the Mediterranean, and then we had 5 Foxtrots leaving the Mediterranean. And it was a fantastic Kubik dance, if you want to call it that. Here we have a Foxtrot. You could see the tracks in the lower box. This is the Courtney's tracks from the 6th of November all the way through the Friday the 10th. And you can see how we're moving progressively eastward, tracking the submarine as it's moving eastward itself. Actually, it was more than one that we were hot on. Now, and when I mentioned exercise support, that was the next aspect of the planning bit that we did. This was a National Week exercise, National Week exercise at 11. It was from 2 to 10 November, 1971. And as these are the tracks, the Courtney tracks, were going back and forth. The ship was deployed ahead of the carrier battle group. As the carrier battle group would move through the area, whoops, sorry. And you could see on the track that the Courtney had on 8-9 November detected the USS Taranti, which was mimicking a Foxtrot class diesel boat, 30 nautical miles off the southern coast of Crete. The Taranti was using the same, it was a mirror image of, if you would, of what the Foxtrots would use in the North African coast. The Taranti was doing the same thing with the southern coast of Crete, hugging the coast and trying to mask itself, but we picked it up at that range and vectored a P3 on it, and which was a bit of surprise for the bubbleheads. They thought they were okay. They were on the surface when they were caught, and it was quite an exercise. There's Taranti right there. Now I mentioned about special operations, hydrographic operations. Here is a track of the USS Van Varis. This was in October 1970. These tracks represented, if you would, as you can see, especially up the upper tracks, she was tracking a nuke. That's what it seems to be based on what I've got from the standpoint of the ship's logs from the Andrew Jackson, as well as from the ship's logs from the Glamagor. That Van Varis rendezvoused with the Andrew Jackson and took personnel off, and then later on came back on station and worked with the Glamagor, and also rendezvoused with Glamagor and took specialists off her, and then returned to Naples. So this was an operation in which we were testing the system against our own. There's a photo of the Jackson. Now, there was another aspect of special hydrographic operations in August of 72. Two of the ships were sent out into the East Atlantic. And you can see by the tracks here, they were set up off the Iberian coast, and he went anti-clockwise. Now, this is obviously a major thoroughfare for shipping going from the English Channel down towards the Mediterranean. The object of this exercise was to determine how well this system could detect, track, identify surface traffic as well as submarines, to differentiate between the two in a very, very high density environment. This proved, the results of this exercise was the establishment of the NAVFAC out of Wales, which sent SOSIS arrays down west of the Bay of Biscay and down towards the Iberian Peninsula. So the success of this special operations established, if you would, the NAVFAC up in Wales, which then we were able to track Soviet subs coming out from the Northern Fleet and be able to track them as they went through the gap, down the coast and into the Mediterranean. Here's a picture of the NAVFAC in Wales. Now, by 1973, as I mentioned, the ships were absolutely worn out. They were suffering from considerable engineering issues. They were condemned and ordered back to the Atlantic in just as Yom Kippur broke out. Here they are in Rota, Spain. Here they are back in Norfolk. They never returned to Newport. They went straight to Norfolk. They were, here's the change, well, here's the decommissioning. And you could see the ITASS vans are off the ship, and the ensigns are being lowered for the last time. All three ships were condemned by December of 1973. And here is the Hammerberg, and look behind her, you could see the Twin Towers. This is in the Jersey City shipyards. So what's the legacy? Well, Rear Admiral Weschler visited the ships in the summer of '73, and he said, "You guys done good." And in fact, he announced at the time that in 1972, CIC was contracted for 6 new systems called TASS. That was followed, and here we are with the next generation, our TASS ships. Now here, these are tactics that were employed, which were actually the tactics that we used. But this was in advance. This was courtesy of Captain Stiegel when he was a young officer on one of these ships out of Pearl Harbor. And they were tasked against the SSBNs of the Yankee class. They were in the Yankee boxes off the West Coast. And the successes that these ships had against these submarines were quite noted. Here's an aspect of the tactics. They would get the bearing, task the P3 on it. P3 would localize with its buoys, and off they go. The next generation of TASS, and then TAC-TASS on the Knox, on the Perrys, on the Spruances, and on the Burkes. But there was, like I said, there was a 2-track here that was for the tactical, and then there was for SIRTASS. Here was the first generation of SIRTASS ships, the monohulls, and that was followed by our SWAT design ships. There are presently 5 that are operational. I was informed last week that the former SECNAV, the Honorable Del Toro, signed a contract for 5 replacements. These are going to be commissioned somewhere before 2030. They're going to have the next generation of SIRTASS systems on board, which will have not only a passive, but also a low-frequency active sensor. And these are going to be positioned in the Pacific. So anyway, companions, this is very quickly. This is a story about these 3 ships, their men, also a story of the evolution of passive towed array sonar, as well as the success that it enjoys to this very day. And I thank you all for the opportunity. Oh, by the way, the guy over here on the right in the center, that's me. Ho ho. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you, John. That was a fascinating review of a period where I suspect quite a few of us cut our teeth. I was a West Coast sailor, so I didn't get to enjoy those days in the Med, but a lot of what you spoke about really did resonate. Just a couple of questions. We're running late, but I wanted to give you every minute I could.
Sorry, I hope I didn't go too far over.
No, we're okay. We got time for just a couple of questions. Sure. Back in the early research, early 20th century, where the hydrophones were against the hull, wasn't ship's noise impediment to those hydrophones effectively?
I would definitely think so. That they were placed on the Joette as far forward as possible.
But still,
yeah,
then
sure.
You get the bow noise. Yeah. Okay. It sounds like, and I think you answered my question later on, we had a pretty good handle. Those towed array systems did a great job of actually tracking. What's our confidence that we had a good handle on how many subs were in the Med and where they were located?
Well, that came through primary source. We had the development of the OSIS capability, naval intelligence, the OSIS nodes, but also they were fairly cooperative. Soviet subs of that generation were noisy as heck. They were really, really noisy boats. So, of course, when the conventional boats would go silent, it was like a black hole in the water. But but when they had to move, they were extremely noisy. Of course, that got better and better thanks to the Walker treason, for example, as well as was it Toshiba sold the Soviets special cutting devices for propellers. So those combinations, but still, even through the early 80s, we still had the advantage on them. Of course, that was getting less and less. That's why, for example, these succeeding systems of CERTAS and TACTAS is a combination of not only passive but also low frequency active sonars, using, as we call a bistatic. This is my understanding, a bistatic concept, sending out pulses, and then the receive end would be the
right.
tail.
And then, the challenge with active is, of course, makes it easier for you to be detected.
Oh, of course, yeah. It's like a 10-to-1, isn't it?
I have a question. Maybe it's a strange question about Socius, but when I read Hunt for Red October, I was pretty surprised to see Clancy included discussion of Socius. So what I felt was cavalierly. As far as I know, it was still classified. When did Socius become declassified?
Oh gosh, I would imagine just shortly after the fall of the wall. I mean, we went through. We're talking about the peace dividend, and we started shutting down these facilities so quickly, and converting them to doing scientific studies.
Right, right.
Sure.
So we are coming up at the top of the hour, and I do want to just again thank you for a fascinating brief. Maybe we'll put you on the agenda for Congress. You planning on joining us in Philly in October?
When is that going to be anyway?
It officially starts the 14th of October.
Yes.
The Navy Ball is the 11th of October, and I'm trying to see how many people I can convince to join me at the Navy Ball on Saturday night, the 11th.
In Philadelphia?
In Philadelphia.
Oh, that's great. Well, I think Judy and I will be there. The following week we'll be in England.
Okay, so I will remind you, and I'll talk to Rick Sperry to reach out to you as he puts together our educational programming for Congress, because this is a great topic, and it's particularly, it's one thing to hear from somebody who's researched a topic. It's a whole different game to hear from somebody that's lived it.
Yeah.
I do want to take a moment to promote Homecoming 250. Next October and November are the respective 250th birthdays of the Navy and the Marine Corps. And so it's going to be a really busy time in Philadelphia, and we scheduled Congress so we could piggyback on a lot of Homecoming 250 activities. Finally, I want to ask everybody to mark your calendars for 27 February, Thursday evening, 1900 hours Eastern Standard Time. Captain Michael Lilly will return. This time he'll be discussing Japan's doomed plans to invade and occupy Hawaii. This is piggybacked on the article that was just published in December's Naval History Magazine, the online edition. So mark your calendars for 27 February. Look forward to seeing you all then. And John, again, thank you for a great presentation this evening.
Well, thank you.
Take it away, and we'll see everybody next month.
Thank you again.